how the U.S.-led airstrikes in Syria hit their targets before Assad's missile defenses even fired. Electronic warfare suppression, a decoy battle group in the Mediterranean and never-before-used stealth missiles were all part of the attack. Western powers said on Saturday their missile attacks struck at the heart of Syria's chemical weapons program, but the restrained assault appeared unlikely to halt Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's progress in the 7-year-old civil war. The United States, France and Britain launched 105 missiles overnight in retaliation for a suspected poison gas attack in Syria a week ago, targeting what the Pentagon said were 3 chemical weapons facilities, including a research and development center in Damascus Bars district and 2 installations near Homs. Russia claimed early Saturday morning that Syrian air defenses had shot down 71 of the over 100 missiles fired by the coalition, a claim the Pentagon refuted. No Syrian weapon had any effect on anything we did, Lieutenant General Kenneth McKenzie said. He described the joint US, French and UK strike as precise, overwhelming and effective. In fact, most of the Syrian countermeasures, including air defense missiles, were fired after US and allied missiles had already hit their targets, McKenzie told reporters on Saturday. The Syrian air defenses not only missed the incoming missiles but they kept firing even after the last US, British and French strikes were complete. Some of those more than 40 Syrian missile interceptors, he suggested, might have hit civilian targets. According to the Pentagon, 19 new Lockheed Martin extended-range stealthy joint air-to-surface standoff attack munitions, JASSM, were launched by 2 B-1B bombers based out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. The bombers were accompanied by a single EA-6B Prowler for electronic warfare suppression, potentially against Russian air defenses, as well as tanker support, according to a Joint Staff spokesman. Defense News added, inclusion of the EA-6B is notable, as that aircraft was officially retired by the Navy in 2015 in favor of the more advanced EA-18G Growler. 6 Tomahawk cruise missiles were also launched from the Virginia-class USS John Warner submarine according to the Pentagon. The U.S. guided missile destroyer USS Winston Churchill and another U.S. destroyer, the USS Donald Cook, were deployed to the Mediterranean Sea as an apparent decoy to draw Russian and Syrian attention away from the 3 U.S. battleships which fired the other 60 Tomahawk missiles from the Red Sea and North Arabian Gulf. The cruiser USS Monterey fired 30 Tomahawks and the destroyer USS Laboon fired 7 from the Red Sea, while the USS Higgins fired 23 Tomahawks from the North Arabian Gulf, according to McKenzie. The bombing was the biggest intervention by Western countries against Assad and his superpower ally Russia, but the 3 countries said the strikes were limited to Syria's chemical weapons capabilities and not aimed at toppling Assad or intervening in the civil war. The air attack, denounced by Damascus and its allies as an illegal act of aggression, was unlikely to alter the course of a multi-sided war that has killed at least 500,000 people. U.S. President Donald Trump called the operation a success. He proclaimed on Twitter, "Mission accomplished," echoing former President George W. Bush, whose use of the same phrase in 2003 to describe the U.S. invasion of Iraq was widely ridiculed as violence that had dragged on for years. "We believe that by hitting bars, in particular, we've attacked the heart of the Syrian chemicals weapon program," McKenzie said as the Pentagon. However, McKenzie acknowledged elements of the program remain and he could not guarantee that Syria would be unable to conduct a chemical attack in the future. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said at an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council that Trump told her that if Syria uses poisonous gas again, the United States is locked and loaded. The Western countries said the strikes were aimed at preventing more Syrian chemical weapons attacks after a suspected poison gas attack in Douma on April 7 killed up to 75 people. They blame Assad's government for the attack. In Washington, a senior administration official said on Saturday that while the available information is much greater on the chlorine use, we do have significant information that also points to sarin use in the attack. Speaking at a summit in Peru, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence seemed less sure of the use of sarin, saying that Washington may well determine that it was used along with chlorine. Assad resilience. 10 hours after the missiles hit, smoke was still rising from the remains of 5 destroyed buildings of the Syrian Scientific Research Center in Bars, where a Syrian employee said medical components were developed. There were no immediate reports of casualties. Syria released video of the wreckage of a bombed-out research lab, but also of Assad arriving at work as usual, with the caption "Morning of Resilience." Late on Saturday Syria time, a large explosion was heard in a Syrian government-controlled area in a rural region south of Aleppo, according to the Britain-based War Monitor, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. The observatory said the cause of the explosion was unknown, as well as its target. Russian and Iranian military help over the past 3 years has allowed Assad to crush the rebel threat to topple him. The United States, Britain and France have all participated in the Syrian conflict for years, arming rebels, bombing Islamic State fighters and deploying troops on the ground to fight that group. But they have refrained from targeting Assad's government, apart from a volley of U.S. missiles last year. Although the Western countries have all said for 7 years that Assad must leave power, they held back in the past from striking his government, lacking a wider strategy to defeat him. Syria and its allies also made clear that they considered the attack a one-off, unlikely to do meaningful harm to Assad. A senior official in a regional alliance that backs Damascus told Reuters the sites that were targeted had been evacuated days ago thanks to a warning from Russia. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the strikes were unacceptable and lawless. Syrian state media called them a flagrant violation of international law, while Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei called it a crime and the Western leaders criminals. British Prime Minister Theresa May described the strike as limited and targeted, with no intention of toppling Assad or intervening more widely in the war. Washington described the strike targets as a center near Damascus for the research, development, production and testing of chemical and biological weapons, a chemical weapons storage site near the city of Homs, and another site near Homs that stored chemical weapons equipment and housed a command post. The Pentagon said there had been chemical weapons agents at one of the targets, and that the strikes had significantly crippled Syria's ability to produce such weapons. Trump spoke to May and French President Emmanuel Macron to discuss results of the strikes, the leaders' offices said. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres urged all Security Council members to exercise restraint and avoid escalation in Syria, but said allegations of chemical weapons use demand an investigation. In Sydney, Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull urged Russia to drop its pretense that Syria was not behind the chemical attack on Homa and use its influence to force the Assad government to destroy its chemical weapons. Russia has used its position as a member of the United Nations Security Council to veto resolutions designed to ensure that this chemical weapons crime is thoroughly investigated and cannot be repeated, he told a news conference on Sunday. It should stop all the denial and the pretense that it wasn't an action by the Syrian government and ensure that the chemical weapons are destroyed, that the ability of the regime to use chemical weapons is eliminated and that this type of criminal conduct does not occur again. Weapons inspections. Inspectors from the Global Chemical Weapons Watchdog OPCW were due to try to visit Doma on Saturday to inspect the site of this suspected gas attack. Moscow condemned the Western states for refusing to wait for their findings. Russia, whose relations with the West have deteriorated to levels of Cold War-era hostility, has denied any gas attack took place in Doma and even accused Britain of staging it to whip up anti-Russian hysteria. The Western countries took precautions to avoid unexpected conflict with Russia. French Defense Minister Florence Parly said Russians was warned beforehand to avert conflict. Dmitry Bulik, a Russian member of parliament who was in Damascus and witnessed the strikes, told Reuters, the attack was more of a psychological nature rather than practical. Luckily there are no substantial losses or damages. In Doma, site of this suspected gas attack, the last buses were due on Saturday to transport out rebels and their families who agreed to surrender the town, state TV reported. that effectively ends all resistance in the suburbs of Damascus known as Eastern Ghouta, marking one of the biggest victories for Assad's government of the war. The Western assault involved more missiles than a U.S. attack last year but struck targets limited to Syria's chemical weapons facilities. The U.S. intervention last year had effectively no impact on the war. Syria agreed in 2013 to give up its chemical weapons after a nerve gas attack killed hundreds of people in Douma. Damascus is still permitted to have chlorine for civilian use, although its use as a weapon is banned. Allegations of Assad's chlorine use have been frequent during the war, although, unlike nerve agents, chlorine did not produce mass casualties as seen last week. U.S. airstrikes on Syria, the view from Russia. The Russian government has been a close ally of President Bashar Assad's regime. NPR's Michelle Martin talks with Moscow-based reporter Charles Maines about how Russians view the U.S. airstrikes on Syria. Michelle Martin, host. Now to Russia. While the US, the UK and France say their joint airstrikes were justified, the action is being seen quite differently in Russia. Russia is, of course, an ally of Syria. Joining us now from Moscow is independent journalist Charles Maines. Charles, thank you so much for joining us. Charles Maines, good to be with you. Martin, just what exactly have Russian officials been saying about the airstrikes? Maines, well, you know, from President Putin on down to his foreign minister, to his foreign envoy, Russia's been arguing that this attack violates international law. President Putin issued a statement very early this morning on Saturday saying that, calling it an act of aggression against this sovereign state. He said, once again, this is a case where the U.S. has destabilized the Middle East, very much in line with Iraq, and that, you know, these charges against Assad using chemical weapons were merely a pretext to attack. The Russian argument, it's really focused on the timing of these attacks, just as this international team of the OPCW, as the previous segment noted, is on the ground investigating these charges of chemical weapons used. And just remember that Russia says that, you know, the Bashar al-Assad's government gave up these weapons, these chemical weapons, back in 2013 when Putin brokered a deal with the Obama administration. So that, you know, any remaining stocks, Russia says, are either in the hands of terrorists or pro-Russia-backed rebels. Or, as they say here, it's just fakery to serve Western aims to depose Assad. Martin, has this affected the relationship between Washington and Moscow, and, more specifically, between President Trump and President Putin? Maines, well, you know, the relationship between President Trump and President Putin, or Russia and the US, has been on such a roller coaster ride since Trump took office. I mean, we had first this incredible excitement here over Trump's election win. That then turned all this dismay over the gulf between what candidate Trump said he wanted, which was better relations, and what the realities of Trump presidency abroad, which has been more sanctions, not less. You know, but still, Moscow also kind of gave Trump a pass. I mean, they blamed the problems on hawks in Congress or the so-called deep state that won't let Trump, you know, be Trump. You know, and it seemed occasionally to pay off. You had this moment where Trump extended the idea of a summit meeting with Vladimir Putin, something that the Russian government was very eager for. You know, but then we have Syria. And Trump has really, you know, singled out Putin, saying that he personally bears responsibility for Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons. You know, the president is kind of known for bending over backwards to not say anything negative about Putin, and suddenly, this is a real shift. So although it's, I suppose, important to point out that he hasn't exactly given him one of his famous Twitter nicknames yet. But maybe that's coming. Martin, before we let you go, Charles, was there any danger that US and Russian forces would find themselves facing each other in these airstrikes? And is that something to be concerned about going forward? Maines, well, it was, and it still is, I think. Russian media in particular has been ratcheting up this idea of, you know, full-on panic, that World War III was just, you know, minutes away, perhaps, telling people how to stockpile water, survive a nuclear apocalypse. And yet still we here, are all here. And so I think part of the reason for that is Russia's defense ministry came out today. They confirmed that the US airstrikes avoided hitting Russian bases in Syria. There are no Russian casualties, which is important. And the fact was that the Russian air defenses, which they said they might deploy, actually hadn't been deployed. So for all this, bluster that we hear out of Moscow, Russia really kind of sat this one out. The defense ministry also said today that they were considering helping Damascus beef up its air defenses, including giving them Russia's much vaunted, this S-300 surface-to-air missile systems. And that is certainly worrisome. But there is one good sign that you've got also a hint here in Moscow of some kind of back-channel diplomacy. We heard from the US ambassador, Job Huntsman, who said that, in fact, the US had informed Russia in advance of its moves to avoid Russian casualties with that specific purpose. So there is this, sign that perhaps, despite all this heated rhetoric, at least on both sides kind of acknowledged that it's important to keep this from spinning out of control. Martin, that is independent journalist Charles Maines joining us from Moscow. Charles, thank you. Maines.